on to the next presentation by Daniel Kephart. You are a doctoral student from the University of Rochester, New York State, USA. And the presentation is on the autumn of the world, an ecocritical perspective on Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Martina. And to everybody who was involved in any way in organizing this week's symposium, it's really been a delight, I think, to be able to be here virtually and celebrate the impact of literature today. Sometime in the 1930s, we don't know exactly when, J.R.R. Tolkien began writing a poem in modern English, but in the same poetic meter as Beowulf. This was not a poem about elves, as was his wont, nor was it a poem about hobbits, dwarves, or any of the other denizens of Middle-earth. This was a poem about King Arthur. And thanks to Tolkien's personal correspondence, much of which still survives today, we know that the great British writer Kingsley Amis was among the first and the few to see this fledgling poem. And Amis, we read, was amazed. In fact, he writes to Tolkien that he just couldn't help but declaim the lines of this poem aloud in a British train cabin for everyone to hear. And I'm a poor substitute for Kingsley Amis, but I'll indulge that same instinct here, and I'll share the opening of this poem. Arthur eastward in arms purposed, his war to wage on the wild marches, over seas sailing to Saxon lands from the Roman realm, ruin defending. Thus the tides of time to turn backward, and the heathen to humble his hope urged him, that with harrying ships they should hunt no more on the shining shores and shallow waters of South Britain, booty seeking. As when the earth dwindles in autumn days, and soon to its setting, the sun is waning under mournful mist, then a man will lust for work and wandering. Yet while warm floweth blood sun-kindled, so burned his soul after long glory for a last essay of pride and prowess, to the proof setting, will unyielding, in war with fate. Thus begins the fall of Arthur, Tolkien's only and incomplete sojourn into the world of Arthuriana. And compared to his other works, it's relatively mysterious. There are fans of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings the world over. Just this summer, while I was in Italy, I met a young man who was using the latter book to learn English on the beach. But there are far, far fewer fans of The Fall of Arthur. For many years, in fact, the work was not available at all. Due to its incomplete state and its separation from the realms of Middle-earth, other stories and projects received precedence. Perhaps this is due to the esoteric seclusion in the vaults of Tolkien's draft, but The Fall of Arthur eventually became something of a legendary tome among Tolkien aficionados. And if you went to conferences or meetings together, you could find Tolkien fans whispering in corners about that Arthurian story that Humphrey Carpenter had mentioned in his authorized biography of Tolkien. But when Mariner Books finally did release The Fall of Arthur in 2013, there was something of a collective wistful sigh. The book was not what many people had expected. Verlyn Flieger, who is perhaps the greatest living commentator on Tolkien's writing, wrote that if you were looking for a substantial volume containing a finished, fully realized work, you were in for disappointment. Christopher Snyder, in his review in Arthuriana, which is a very prominent journal for scholars of the Arthur legend, concluded that The Fall of Arthur was not a major contribution to either the Arthurian or the Tolkienian corpus. And even internet celebrity and university president Corey Olson, better known online as the Tolkien professor, admitted that the impact of The Fall of Arthur is limited by its unfinished state. So, just to reiterate, The Fall of Arthur was not what many readers had hoped for, and at its end, much of the audience evidently felt themselves alike to the story's version of King Arthur, who stands upon a blood-soaked beach, feeling lost and entirely without direction. Well, I will confess right away that I do not share this popular evaluation or this sentiment of disappointment. And so in this essay today, I'd like to offer an eco-critical reading of The Fall of Arthur. But what, other than a fashionable scholarly buzzword, is eco-criticism? The British literary critic Gillian Rudd, or rather Gillian Rudd, writes that eco-criticism strives to move away from the anthropocentrism which creates and operates a value system in which the only things that are seen, let alone valued, are those that serve some kind of purpose in human terms. Eco-criticism works to muddy the lines between the artificial and the natural, since even the artifices of human beings are themselves part of a larger natural world. In reading The Fall of Arthur, then, I want to muddy the lines between complete and incomplete, drawing attention to the literary completeness of The Fall of Arthur, which exists independent of Tolkien's further plans for the work. And by the end of our time, I hope to make it clear that The Fall of Arthur is a text which absolutely demands further study, even if it does not trace its narrative all the way to Arthur's death. And as a reminder, the Canterbury Tales isn't finished either. So returning to the passage excerpted above, I want to note how The Fall of Arthur begins by questioning the centrality of human action to world history. In the opening lines, we read that Arthur purposed to travel east on an errand of conquest. The king plans the tides of time to turn backward. At first, this story appears to be rooted exclusively in the abstracted will of human beings, who through sheer grit will try and reverse their fortune. But we need only continue reading to find that Arthur's will unyielding is itself actually a purely natural phenomenon. Arthur's thematic, soulful rage is seasonal, because according to the narrator, this is just how men behave when their blood is still running hot with summer heat, even as the sun sets and the air begins to take on an autumn chill. In other words, Arthur's war with fate and natural entropy is itself just a part of the greater ecosystem which Arthur inhabits. And this notion of a text as ecosystem is something central to any eco-critical reading, as one literary artifact is, after all, nothing more than a collision of a multiplicity of traditions, ideas, experiences, codes, grammar, and much, much more. In eco-critical reading, to again quote Rudd, balance is achieved not through the eradication of one thing and the total dominance of another, but by a constant movement of position that keeps everything in play, in the constant shift of life and death, survival and extinction. Mutual interdependence, and there's that word that we've been hearing all morning, is the watchword or watch phrase, if you like, of the eco-critical perspective. Without thee, there is no me. And with this perspective in mind, The Fall of Arthur becomes a flourishing ecosystem of interdependent concepts and narrative threads, quite whole, despite Tolkien's failure, if one dares even use that word, to complete his ends for it. Consider, for instance, this passage, which describes Sir Gawain, Tolkien's last remaining kindred, as the two heroes return to wreak vengeance upon Mordred, the traitorous knight who has usurped the crown. Now Gawain's glory golden riding as the westering sun that the world kindles, ere he red sinketh by the rim of the ocean, before Arthur blazed while the east darkened. Notice how Tolkien's syntax challenges and disrupts the reader's sense of Gawain and the sun as discrete objects. What this sentence communicates, effectually, grammatically speaking, is this. While the east darkens, Gawain's glory blazed brightly beside Arthur like the setting sun, which shines bright red before sinking below the horizon. As readers, however, our experience of these lines is fractured by their disruptive syntax and blurred focus. Instead of moving from setting to character and from character to simile, the passage introduces a character, interjects a camouflage simile, before finally concluding with a description of the setting. We leave the passage not with a sense that Gawain is a man moving over and against a background of nature, but rather with an intuitive grasp of the fact that Gawain is himself a part of this natural world. This interconnectedness can seem rather utopian, and maybe it is. On the other hand, in order for things to be truly interconnected, they must be mutually capable of asserting influence against one another. There must be room for struggle, otherwise there is no true independence. Otherwise, this text is little more than a quaint adoption of nature language for anthropogenic purposes. And such texts, by the way, require not just ecocritical reading, but ecocritical critique as well. There do, however, exist passages wherein the Fall of Arthur subverts this anthropocenic outlook. We find one such passage in Canto 1, which largely details the conquests of a Christian and Roman Arthur in a European continent, which Tolkien quite self-awarely anachronistically characterizes as pagan. In this passage, we find Tolkien's famous first ever mention of Mirkwood, that concept of the forest as an inosculated wasteland, which would be so critical in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Note how this passage shifts the focus from human to natural action. Foes before them, flames behind them, ever east and onward eager rode they, and folk fled before them as the face of God, till the earth was empty, and no eyes saw them, and no ears heard them in the endless hills, save bird and beast baleful haunting the lonely lands. Thus at last came they to Mirkwood's margin. Under mountain shadows waste was behind them, walls before them. On the houseless hills ever higher mounting, vast, unvanquished, lay the veiled forest. Dark and dreary were the deep valleys, where limbs gigantic of lowering trees in endless aisles were arched o'er rivers, flowing down afar from fells of ice, among ruinous rocks, ravens croaking, eagles answered in the air wheeling, wolves were howling on the wood's border, cold blew the wind, keen and wintry. In rising wrath, from the rolling forest among roaring leaves, rain came darkly, and the sun was swallowed in sudden tempest. As readers, we can easily infer that traveling through such a grim region would be a trial to the Arthurian army. But this passage, I want to note, makes no reference to the feelings or perceptions of the human army as it marches to the edge of Mirkwood. The focus is instead entirely upon the landscape, which is paradoxically, to the humans, empty, and yet full of birds and beasts, baleful, haunting its houseless hills. It's a faceless land in the human sense, but it's certainly not a silent one. Instead, it's alive with the howls of wolves, the screeches of eagles, the croak of ravens, and the movement of trees. This is not a place where human actions are the center of importance. Esteemed eco-critic William Cronon, in his landmark work Uncommon Ground, Rethinking the Human Place in Nature, wrote extensively about the post-19th century tendency to romanticize the wilderness as an untouched Eden, safe from human corruption. But for the majority of history, Cronon argues, the wilderness was actually the home of the demonic rather than the divine. To be a wilderness, then, writes Cronin, was to be deserted, savage, desolate, barren. In short, a waste, the word's nearest synonym. And it's therefore deeply significant that Tolkien describes a waste behind Arthur's host and walls before them as they approach Mirkwood. Faced with these two alternative understandings of the wilderness, Tolkien selects his own path, a third way. In the aftermath of Arthur's march, there is a waste, as the Fall of Arthur understands the idea, a barren landscape once populated, pillaged, and made the victim of a human being's thematic inclination towards violence, a bit like Angband or Utumno, as we just heard. In stark contrast to this wasteland stands the walls of Mirkwood and the cacophony of languages spoken by the wild beasts. We should remember that walls are the signifier of civilization. Thus, ironically, Mirkwood is a civilized place, even though it is not a human place, and its cosmopolitan environment is not one that Arthur or his men can access. In traditional narratives, of course, walls demarcate the space where encircling nature is kept at bay by the structured resistance of human civilization. Many of you already know that Gawain's sojourn in the wilderness in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight ends at the high walls of Ho Desert. Nehemiah's reconstruction of Jerusalem in the Hebrew scriptures focuses upon the reconstruction of its walls in 52 days, and its magic walls that encircle the hyper-civilized wizarding academy of Hogwarts in Harry Potter. In the Fall of Arthur, though, civilized nature walls out the wild human. Here is a threshold that Arthur cannot cross, held at bay by the forest's menacing darkness, in much the same way we often describe nocturnal predators as fearing human firelight. Here, however, it is Arthur's firelight, not the forest's shadow, which is lurking predatorily at the edges before finally turning away. Now, I don't mean to suggest, and it would be a mistake to characterize Arthur's conquest as evil or misguided within the structure of this text, even if it brings him into conflict with what we commonly label the natural world, because as we've already mentioned, struggle is inherent to nature. And as a part of the natural world, it is inevitable that human beings should struggle against competing forces. And nowhere is this better seen in the Fall of Arthur than when we meet Lancelot, who sits dejectedly in his home beyond the sea, wondering if there can ever be a redemption for his decision to betray his own king. His heart arose, as were heavy burden lightly lifted. Alone standing with the flame of morning in his face burning, he felt the surge he felt of song forgotten, in his heart moving as harp music. There Lancelot, low and softly to himself singing, the sun greeted, life from darkness, lifted shining. In the dome of heaven by death exalted, ever times would change and tides alter. And over the hills of morning, hope comes striding to awake the weary while the world lasted. Facing the rising sun, Lancelot feels the weight of his transgression lifted from his soul, and he begins to sing. The sun setting and rising, here described as a form of death and rebirth, provides the grief-stricken Lancelot with the reminder he needs that all human actions take place within a grander ecosystem. And while the world endures, the passage concludes, there are always opportunities to turn toward hope. Yes, Arthur's kingdom, as we already know as 21st century readers, is at its demise. But demise is a part of the natural cycle. A figurative darkness may fall over Britain when the Arthurian realm crumbles, but it is only a figurative darkness. The sun will continue to rise each morning, and the actions of even some very powerful human beings cannot change that fact. So, to conclude, The Fall of Arthur, I believe, is the work of Tolkien which has received the least adequate degree of scholarly attention. Compared to his other more popular works, there are simply too many loose ends here for our comfort. We crave definitive answers, texts with clear-cut endings, and a narrative which, human or hobbit action, is categorically the most important thing. But we do not find that in The Fall of Arthur. We find instead a text which treats human action as important, but not ultimately important. A text which is willing to treat nature as something which includes human civilization rather than as a wilderness that must be beaten back by city lights. There is much more in this text to be discussed, not the least of which, I think, is whether or not in our own time of computer server farms and mass production, Tolkien's optimistic conclusions about nature's restorative powers remain believable. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. Are there any questions in our audience or online participants? Okay, looks like no questions. Maybe I have something to say. Especially this what you concluded at the end, that the nature is like superior to human activity, brought to me two images from the Lord of the Rings. On one hand, it's also the idea of the elves who are trying to like conserve the world in an unchanging state, which is represented as something bad, something whereby they are revolting against the natural order of the world. And the other idea is that, it slipped my mind. The nature itself eventually revolts against those who abuse it. In our world, is maybe not as remarkable because it's just through the form of natural disasters, some kind of changes in the weather and the climate, which can be really slow and not noticeable. That in Tolkien's work, he kind of like personalizes or personifies the nature in the characters of the Ents who revolt against the abusers, especially Saruman.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the really interesting things about The Fall of Arthur in comparison with the Legendarium is, in many ways, I think this is the only text where darkness is a little bit more ambiguous in its sort of moral nature. Here, darkness doesn't seem to be necessarily a bad thing. It just seems to be part of the process. And the fact that Tolkien did abandon this work, he had some intentions to return to it at the end of his life, but he never did, I think maybe speaks to the idea that he found the way he handled light and nature and those themes more compelling in Middle-earth. And he found that a more suitable way of looking in the world. But I think this is in a fascinating exploration as a text of an idea that Tolkien had early in his professorial years and never really developed to its fullest extent. By the way, just as a sort of point of conclusion, I'll say that I've posted my email in the chat. If any of you are ever interested in getting involved virtually or otherwise over here in Rochester with the Academy, just let me know. We would always be happy to foster that spirit of collaboration. It's what makes this all so worthwhile. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation.